As Steve said, it is time to get Southern California interested in John Ruskin. So we're going to try to do this over the next 2 days. I'm going to begin as follows. God has lent us the earth for our life. It is a great entail. It belongs as much to those who are to come after us and whose names are already written in the book of creation as to us. And we have no right by anything that we do or neglect to involve them in unnecessary penalties or deprive them of benefits which it was in our power to bequeath. Every human action gains in honor, in grace, in all true magnificence by its regard for things that are yet to come. Therefore, when we build or create, let us build or create forever. Let it not be for present delight, not for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for. And let us think that there will come a time when they see the stones we have laid and the words we have written and bless us for having done so. That's John Ruskin from his great work, The 7 Lamps of Architecture. He wrote it in 1847. It's a book, and I have studied urban architecture pretty much all my professional life. It is a book that remains, in my view, the greatest book on architecture that ever was done, and I will have something a little bit later to hopefully convince you of that. Here's another Ruskin quote that I thought you might enjoy. It comes from a series of essays Ruskin published about 12 years after The 7 Lamps of Architecture, called The Two Paths. The finest art, he tells us, is that in which the hand, the head, and the heart go together. Fine art must always be produced by that subtlest of all machines, the human hand. No machine yet contrived, no machine hereafter contrivable will ever equal the fine machinery of the human finger. Thoroughly perfect art is that which proceeds from the heart, which involves all the noble emotions, associates with the head, and then the hand. And thus we bring out the whole man. It's a lovely quote. It's a lovely painting of Ruskin by Sir John Everett Millais, done in the early 1850s. I'm going to read you another passage to start us off, a third excerpt, because it contrasts quite a bit with the two I've just shared with you. Ruskin began life as an art critic, or began his adult life as an art critic, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And his idea was that art was the great communicating tool of human beings, to show each other the most essential things in life, and then to have them, through their understanding of art, come closer to the creation itself and to nature. And as the years, he wrote, his first 5 or 6 books were really all about art and architecture, and trying to tell people in the process of doing that how wonderful nature was. He wanted to bring people back to nature, and seeing the wonder that was nature would then want to preserve it as well as delight in it. But as his years went on, he became more and more convinced that people weren't getting the message he was trying to communicate. They loved his books. They loved his words. You can already see why that would be the case. They loved the things that he was trying to communicate, get them in the intellectual world that they lived in, and made them delighted in that. But his deepest idea was to transform society. He was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and he saw quite clearly what was going on, the horrors that were being wrought by the Industrial Revolution. And he became more and more worried that he wasn't reaching the audience, that his books had fallen short of the mark. So he gets, as his years go on and he enters middle age, he gets more and more depressed about the effect that he's had. And it is that moment, or at that time, that he makes a turn that becomes one of the most essential in the intellectual life, I believe, in Western society. This is Ruskin, a picture of him in the 1860s. So in the summer of 1860, he is in Chamonix in the French Alps, his favorite place on earth. And he's thinking about all of these things, and he decides that he now has to write something that will write the heavily listing ship of his society. And so he puts his art criticism aside and begins to write what I would call sociology. He begins to write a series of critiques that will essentially go with him throughout the rest of his life of the social order in which he lives. He doesn't give up art criticism entirely, but he puts it in a secondary position after this. So in the late summer of 1860s, a series of essays begin to appear in a magazine called the Cornhill Magazine, one of the great intellectual magazines of England at the time. And a series of 4 essays called Unto This Last. And the idea, he takes the parable of the owner and the workers in the vineyard from the New Testament and tries to show that the way that the owner treated the workers was essentially the way that all owners and all employers should treat their workers. And if they did, the ship would be righted in the way that he said. That would make things better. We think, this made Ruskin furious, we say when we trade, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Ruskin said, well, why would we say that? Why don't we say emptor securis? Let the buyer be secure that he or she is going to get good product and at a fair price from another decent human being. Why is it that we've turned it the other way? And so he goes in the first essay of Unto This Last, he goes and he reviews what he calls the 5 great professions that all advanced societies have. We have physicians. Their job is to heal us. We have soldiers. Their job is to protect us. We have lawyers. Their job is to do justice for us. We have pastors and teachers, and their job is to teach us about spiritual things and to help us become better human beings. These are 4 of the great 5 professions. And the 5th is the merchant or the businessman or the manufacturer. And suddenly we look at that great profession, which we must have. We have to produce things. And we don't trust these people. The name of the title of the first essay is called The Roots of Honor. Well, we honor the first 4 because they protect us, they heal us, they teach us, they do justice for us. But the 5th we don't think that way about. How come we have this logical inconsistency? So at the very end of the first essay of Unto This Last, Ruskin now says, I'm going to tell you what a merchant's true function is. And so here are a few words. The title of my talk is Why Ruskin, a Humane and Radical Visionary. Here comes the radical part. Observe, he says, that the merchant's function, or the manufacturers or the businessmen, because the terms are essentially interchangeable, is to provide for the nation those things that it needs to better the lives of all of those who live in it. It is no more his function to get profit for himself out of that provision than it is a clergyman's function to get his stipend. That stipend is a due and necessary adjunct, but not the object of life if he be a true clergyman, any more than his fee is the object of life to a true physician. Neither is his fee the object of life to a true merchant. All 3, if true men, all 3 if true men have a work to be done irrespective of fee, the pastor's function being to teach, the physician's to heal, and the merchant's, as I have said, to provide. That is to say, a businessman has to understand to their very root the qualities of the thing he deals in and the means of obtaining and producing it, and he has to apply all his sagacity and energy to the producing and obtaining of it in a perfect state, and then distributing it at the cheapest possible price to those who need it most. That's a radical statement for 1860. And it made a whole bunch of people a little bit nervous when Ruskin came out and with ideas like that. So I'm going to tell you so I'm going to go back and pick up these themes in a moment here. I had another reason for using these three quotes at the very beginning of my talk, because the manuscripts of all three of these Ruskin works, the 7 Lamps of Architecture, the 2 Paths, and Unto This Last, are about 100 yards away in the Munger Library here at Huntington. It's a wonderful collection they have here, and we're so grateful that we're able to have this conference here. And one of the things I'd like to do is to alert you to the wonderful Ruskin things that are here, in hopes that in time to come, some of you may delve into them and write your own books about Ruskin from this experience. So I want to tell you a little bit about who Ruskin was. He was the only son of Margaret and John James Ruskin. Here's a nice picture of them. He was born in London in 1819, which is why it's the bicentennial year of his birth. I want to whet your appetite a little bit for what a special person he has become in the intellectual history of Western society. His father, John James, was a very successful sherry merchant. He sold to the best houses and to the best customers in England, and he made a small fortune, well, probably better than a small fortune, in his sherry trade. And as a result of that, John Ruskin, his son, never really wanted for anything. He was taken care of, he was touted, he was dressed, he was privately educated. When he got to be old enough, he was taken up to Oxford. He was allowed to go to Oxford as a gentleman commoner to get the best education possible at the time. When he was 13 years old, he was given a copy of Samuel Rogers, who was a very well-known poet at the time, Samuel Rogers' book of poems about Italy. And it changed his life. And it changed his life because in that particular volume of poems of Rogers were a number of vignettes that had been painted by this man, Turner. And Ruskin looked at the drawings in the edition of Rogers' Italy, and he said, "Oh my goodness, what a wonderful eye this man has." And so here we have 2 of the vignettes that you would find in the book, which had come out in 1831. The first one is, of course, of the Rialto Bridge in Venice, and the second is some of the mountains of the Great Alps. And Ruskin got so excited about this, he said to his parents, "You must take me to these places so I can see where Turner painted these wonderful things." He sees nature perfectly, beautifully. And so the parents, because anything that John wanted was going to happen, took the time, and they took him to see all of these things. And along the way, he went to wonderful sites where he would go find the exact site where Turner had painted that painting. And this one is the St. Grauschausen and Cat's Castle by Moonlight. And I wanted to show it to you, not only because it's a lovely Turner painting of Europe, but because this painting is on display at the show that Steve Hindle mentioned a few moments ago in the John Ruskin and His Frenemies exhibit, so you can see the Turner there. And he loved Turner so much, and he said, "Nobody paints like Turner." Turner gets it right. This is one of the most famous Turner paintings. It's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston now. Ruskin owned it. He talked his father into buying it for him. And it hung in the Ruskin house in South London for quite a long time. It's called The Slave Ship. And he has a passage in the first volume of Modern Painters, no time today to share it with you, where he walks you around the painting. And he shows you what Turner is doing that no one else can do. He says this is the best picture of the sea that anyone has ever painted. Turner was a painter beyond compare with anyone else. Here's another one. This is now the Valley of the Chamonix, which I mentioned a moment ago. Another wonderful Ruskin painting. So, of course, they went to Chamonix as well. Here's a third Turner that he revered. I love this one. This one is called the Pacifido, and it's at that point, if you've ever been there, where you cross the Alps from the French side. Is that right? No, the Swiss side, and you're going down into Italy. And he picked this particular pass, and look at this wonderful thing that gives you a sense of the power and the magnitude of the Alps. And on their tour, they stopped in Schaffhausen, which is at the very northern end of Switzerland, where it abuts with Germany. And he painted the falls of Schaffhausen for himself. And later, because they became friends with Turner, they would have Turner to dinner on occasion. He showed this painting. Ruskin showed the painting to Turner, and Turner said, "I wish I'd done that one." It's a wonderful painting. And he became a great artist himself. So here are his wild roses that he painted when he was in the Alps. It's a beautiful thing. Here's another. This one's at Harvard at the Fog Museum. This is Amalfi looking up into the mountains. Isn't this just a gorgeous, gorgeous painting? And here is another one which you can see today. This is Ruskin's wonderful painting of the town of Geneva, around 1840. And he just would sit down, and and his hand and his eye were so beautiful, beautifully attuned, and he taught himself to be a great artist. And this is in the Frenemies show that I told you about a moment ago. I love this painting so much. The first time I saw it, I said to Melinda McCurdy, who's the curator of all these wonderful works of art, I said, "You have to lend this to me. 17 years is probably enough. I will be glad to show it to all my friends on the East Coast." She has shown, alas, some reservation about this loan, but you can go and enjoy it today. So he, over the course of from 1843 to 1860, he wrote 5 volumes of modern painters. And Turner is really the hero of almost all of them, though he talks about many other artists as he goes through them. And this is a lovely rendition of an image that is on his gravestone, which I will show you a little bit later. And these books, if you read these books, one of the things I hope I can do is get you excited about reading some Ruskin. So those 2 books that are on sale in the bookstore here, maybe you could pick them up and have a little go at them. They're both wonderful books. One of our speakers, Dinah Birch, you'll hear from her in a few moments, is the editor of one of these. And the passages are so beautiful, they transformed people. They said, "My God, no one's ever written like this about paintings or nature or the world that we live in." And they just loved what he was lionized in British society. They went to all the parties, and he was in this. How famous was Ruskin? Well, he was as famous as Wordsworth. He was as famous as Dickens. He was as famous as Disraeli. He was as famous as George Eliot. He was everywhere at the time. We've forgotten that now, which is a bit of a problem, which I'll tell you a little bit about, and we're going to rectify that beginning today. Virginia Woolf read modern painters around 1900. And here's her reaction 50 years after the last one was written. The style in which page after page of modern painters is written takes our breath away. We find ourselves marveling at the words as if all the fountains of the English language had been set playing in the sunlight for our pleasure. Now, how's that for praise? That's really lovely. The fellow on the right, no, I want to go back, sorry. The fellow on the right is Sir William Harcourt. He's the former Home Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he wrote this in a letter to a friend in 1853. "Have you read the 2nd volume of Ruskin's Stones of Venice yet? If you have not, beg, borrow, or steal it. It is one of the finest things that ever was written, full of inspiring eloquence and genuine genius. It recreates Venice And one felt in reading it not only as if one were there again, but saw much more than is revealed to ordinary eyes. You will be in ecstasies at the gorgeous descriptions of St. Mark's. And Charlotte Bronte read Ruskin. And here's a few of her words about after she had finished the second volume of Modern Painters. She said, "I have lately been reading Mr. Ruskin's Modern Painters," she told a friend in a letter, "and I have derived from the work much genuine pleasure. Hitherto I have only had instinct to guide me in the judging of art and the viewing of nature, and I now feel as if I have been walking blindfold. The book seems to give me eyes." Those kinds of things were commonly said everywhere about Ruskin. I do hope you will go and read some of these things, because as I did the first times that I read them, I would sit there with my mouth open and I would say, my goodness, what astonishing power of the pen. And he did this for so many of these people of the time and became, as I said, extremely well known for this eloquence. Here's another Turner, and I've chosen this one on purpose. It's at the National Gallery, and I saw it this summer, and it's wonderful. And once again, if you go to these places, take your Ruskin with you and read the passages as you look at the paintings. It's a great experience. This is the Fighting Téméraire being tugged to her last berth to be broken up. It's a wonderful painting of Turner's, as you can see, but I chose to put it here because it is, to me, of great symbolic significance, as it was to Ruskin, and I know it was to Turner. It's really quite clear, because what you have is a modern steamship tugging, a ghost ship, a ship that has been built by many human hands, that is really a beautiful work of human creation, to a yard where it's going to be broken down and the various pieces sold for scrap lumber or burned, anything they couldn't. It's a picture depicting the transition of an age. Yeah, and that's really what is most significant about. The tugboat is nothing. It's ugly. It's just nothing. And what is it doing? It's belching out smoke as it does its work and blotting out the sun. This is what Ruskin became more and more worried about as time went on, and he saw that people were. He has a phrase in Unto This Last where he says, "They are consumed," meaning his contemporaries, "by a rage to be rich. They all want to live in immense houses and have many footmen and great carriages. No, one carriage isn't enough. They want 2 carriages, 3. And that was the blinder of the industrial age, this notion that everybody could get rich and enjoy the life, the material life that they never had before. And that's what caused Ruskin to do this turnaround, to try to get his contemporaries away from the covetous life that they led and that we still live. So that's another reason about reading. So I want to take a couple of moments now to tell you why Ruskin made this great turn in his life, and I want to use an example that to me is really symbolic of why he made this turn. He began life as an art critic. Along the way, he started writing a third book, as it was after the second Modern Painters came out. He got really interested in Europe, in architecture, in the architecture of Europe, and he wrote the 7 Lamps of Architecture, which, as I said, is just a few feet away. And one of the places that he loved the most was the city of Rouen. This is a gorgeous picture of the front of the Rouen Cathedral, and those wonderful sculptures. There's hundreds of sculptures here, sort of dropping down like festoons or raindrops on a window pane. This makes this building so incredibly beautiful. And he writes about Rouen at some length in the seven Lamps of Architecture, but really about one place in particular. He takes you around the corner to the north porch, this north entryway into Rouen. And this by itself is beyond beauty, isn't it? I mean, it's just breathtaking imagine the work that went into doing that. But he's not even quite interested in that, because if you've been to Rouen and you go around to the north porch, you see that there are 2 sets of panels that are arranged like this that funnel you into that north door. And they look like this. And there's about 150 panels on one side, one angle. And then there's about 150 panels on the other side. And what Ruskin is most interested in, for the moment, is just one of those panels. And so here's a picture of our Ruskin colleague, Cynthia Gamble, who's not with us today, unfortunately, but she was with us when we took our trip to Rouen to look at this out. And after about an hour of hunting around, we found the one panel that Ruskin is going to tell us about in a moment. And it looks, today, like this. And I want you to look, as you look at the painting, as you look at the photograph, I want you to look at the little man in the lower left, because Ruskin's going to come back to him. So he did one of the illustrations for the 7 lamps, and this is it. And this picture that I've taken is right from the manuscript pages here at the Huntington. He took it, and then now the little man has migrated to the lower right, but that's all right. And up above, we'll look at him on the lower right, and then we'll look at the fellow on the upper right, who is a dragon. And all of these tiles have figures like this. So here's Ruskin's description, and he wants us to understand how special, how wonderful the art of that time was, the art of that the architecture of that time. He says as follows: while there is nothing particularly special about the design of the quatrefoil in which the dragon-like figure on the upper left is placed, nothing exemplary but marvelously skilled, nonetheless, carving of the wings and scales of the creature, there is something extremely special that emerges when you look carefully. There are, in the features of thoughtfulness and fancy which have been rendered into the carving, something which is not common, at least nowadays. The creature is biting something, the form of which is hardly traceable in the now defaced stone, but biting he is, and the reader cannot but recognize in the peculiarly reverted eye an expression which is never seen, as I think, but in the eye of a dog, gnawing something in jest and preparing to start away with it. The meaning of this glance, so far as it can be marked by the mere incision of the chisel, will be felt by comparing it with the eye of the couchant figure on the right, the little man, and its gloomy and angry brooding. The plan of this head and the knot of the cap over its brow are fine, but there's a little touch above the hand, especially well meant. And the hand is pressed hard on the cheekbone, and the flesh of the cheek is wrinkled, and Ruskin underlines wrinkled, under the eye by the pressure, and the whole indeed looks wretchedly coarse when it is seen on a scale in which it is naturally compared to the delicate figure etchings of other great artists, but considering it as a mere filling of an interstice on the outside of a cathedral gate and as one of more than 300 similarly carved creatures, it proves the very noble vitality of the art of this time. These figures, Ruskin is saying, are full of life because those who carved them put their life force into them and made them alive. There can be no doubt about it. The dragon is that sculptor's family's bad dog Spike. There can be no doubt about it. The little man, his crazy Uncle Pierre, who always came to the holiday festivities and made everybody miserable. And you can see these people still in Rouen. And that's another of Ruskin's point. They made something for the ages. When we build, let us build forever. They put their life into it and made these people come alive. With 700 years later, they're there for us to go and enjoy. So now I'm going to tell you a little scholar's story. And you just have to know what it's like. So I'm trying to entice you to do something of this sort. So that is the manuscript page with the quote that I just read. Isn't it terrific? For somebody like me, I was here in September, Gabriel Meyer was with me, and we were looking at the manuscript of the 7 lamps, and we said, oh my God, this is it. This is where he says this. And if you look a little bit more closely down in the lower right-hand side, there's that word wrinkled. And it's underlined because Ruskin thought it was so important. So that's one way to think about this architecture. But I'm going to show you another portion on the same page without straining your eyes too much, or just a couple of sentences. You don't have to read them here because I'm going to read them to you here. And Ruskin writes, I believe that the right question to ask respecting all ornament is simply this: was it done with enjoyment? Was the worker happy while he was about it? It may be the hardest work possible, and harder because so much pleasure was taken in it, but it must have been happy, or it will not be living. Living architecture. 300 of these in one small space on one entryway to one cathedral. That's great architecture, but it's also a testament to happy workers. Here's another plate from the same manuscript of the Seven Lamps. Don't you think the people who made those arches and improved on the ones before delighted in the doing it? Do we not, you and I, vote with our credit cards to go to Europe to see architecture there that we can not see or hardly in any place see here? Do you not think this is in Abbeville? Do you not think that the people who made this arch over the cathedral, the small cathedral, look at the work, look at all the delight in this. But the point to see, the central point to see, is that the workers delighted in what they did. Architecture, Ruskin writes at the very beginning of the Seven Lamps, is the art which so disposes and adorns the edifices raised by human beings, for whatsoever uses, that the sight of them contributes to their mental health, power, and pleasure. Now that, I submit, is quite a definition of architecture. There's nothing about mechanics, there's nothing about skill, there's nothing about form. It's all about the purpose of the act itself, which is to create something really wonderful. When you walk into that building, you are exulting because it's so pretty. When we build, let us build forever. So he wrote another book, which I've alluded to just very briefly, after the Seven Lamps of Architecture, called The Stones of Venice. It's a huge book. This is not your afternoon lark in Ruskin. It's a huge book, and in the second volume of this that Mr. Harcourt was rhapsodizing about not terribly long ago in a quote that I read you, he has a passage that really began to worry many of his contemporaries. And I'm going to share that with you now. And I want you to see how this has grown directly out of the idea about the little man and the dragon in the sculpture of Rouen. Observe, he says, you are to put stern choice to the matter. You must either make a tool of someone who works for you or a man of him. You cannot make both. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you would have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms make curves like compasses, you must unhumanize them. All their attention and strength must go to the accomplishment of the narrow goal, so that in due course, an inevitable course, in time then, both soul and sight will be worn away, and the whole human being lost forever. What was going on in the manufacturing towns of his time was exactly that kind of mechanical work. Dickens, in his wonderful short novel, Hard Times, these people were called the hands, but not because the hands could do the kind of things that the little man and who carved the dragon and the little man in Rouen did, but because they were simply living machines that could be put to work. Here's a little bit more of this. And that here's a third picture. And at our time in history, it is verily the degradation of the operative into a machine, which more than any other evil of the times is leading those so treated everywhere into vain and incoherent, destructive, struggling for a freedom which they cannot explain the nature of to themselves. Their universal outcry, their rage against wealth, against nobility, is not forced from them by pressure of famine. It is not that they are ill-fed, but they have no pleasure in the work in which they make their bread. And they feel that the kind of labor that they are put to is degrading, makes them less than human. Quite literally, they feel their souls withering within them, unthanked, find their whole being sunk into an unrecognized abyss to be counted off into a heap of mechanism, numbered with its wheels and weighed with its hammer strokes. This nature bade not. This God blesses not. This humanity for no long time can endure. And the great cry that rises from all our manufacturing cities, louder than their furnace blasts, is all in very deed for this, that we manufacture everything there but human beings. We blanch cotton, we strengthen steel, we refine sugar, we shape pottery, but to brighten or strengthen or refine or form a single human spirit never enters into our estimate of advantages. And the solution can only come about by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labors are good for men, raising them and making them happy, and by determined sacrifice by ourselves. Let me reread that. By determined sacrifice by ourselves of such convenience or beauty or cheapness as to be got only by the degradation of these workers, and by equally determined demand for the products and the results of healthy and ennobling labor. Well, this began to worry a whole bunch of people out there, because here you had this art critic who was a wonderful art critic, and now you have some sense from Ruskin's words how marvelously he could compose sentences, so transfigure our thinking about something into this particular image of a corrupt society using people simply as machines and ruining their humanity in the process. And so the people who began with loving Ruskin for all these things began to get nervous. And as I told you a moment ago, that by the summer of 1860, he published this little book. This is its first collected edition, the front page from it, called Unto This Last, a treatise on the principles of political economy. Here's what he looked at more or less at the time. He said, you must employ people in work that is good for them, that is healthy for them. And throughout the 1860s, he wrote a whole series of books, which from my point of view, and I think from yours if you read them, certainly are treatises in social critique, in early sociology, where he said, here are the things that you must do. You have ruined the world that you are in. You are destroying the environment. You are raping nature. And you are dehumanizing all the human beings. And why are you doing this? You are doing this for money. You are doing this because you can become richer by the taking advantage of them. So in these books that appeared in the 1860s, other than Unto This Last, Ruskin made a series of recommendations. Here are just a few of them. That we must feed, clothe, and house the poor. That we must retrain anyone who is thrown out of work for whatever reason, so that they will then be able to do gratifying and healthy work in the future. We must pay everyone a decent living wage, enough to keep body and soul together so that they continue to feel gratified in their lives and that they are doing the kinds of things that make them feel that it's worthwhile being a human being. We must have a system of none of these things were going on in Ruskin's time. We must have a system of universal health benefits for everyone. People give our lives to us. We have an obligation to take care of them when they are ill. We must set up a system of old age pensions where as people get older, they are taken care of. They have, after all, given us their lives. So why would we not take care of them? We must educate women equally as men. Women have all the capabilities of men, intellectually, emotionally, and so on, and it's a great tragedy that we have not taken advantage of all of this. We must institute a system of graduated income taxes for people. The rich should pay their share, and more than their share, under normal systems, and much, much more. So, as Ruskin published these things, he became a pariah. He became the great art critic who'd gone bad. And his books stopped selling. Unto this last sold less than 1,000 copies in his lifetime. His lectures, which he collected, some of which I made the recommendations I shared with you a moment ago, didn't sell very well either. By the time the 1860s drew to their close, Ruskin was still extremely famous, but the elites of his society had very little desire to have anything to do with him. In 1869, he was appointed the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford, and he bought a house in the Lake District in England, which was called Brentwood, and he lived there essentially for the rest of his life when he wasn't working, when he wasn't traveling, and when he wasn't teaching at Oxford. And he loved the house out in the countryside. This is his drawing of it in the early 1870s when he bought it. This is the way he looked in the 1870s, and he just wouldn't stop. They just said, you were pretty good as an art critic. You probably should go back to that. But he wouldn't stop, and the fusillades against the corruption of his society just continued. He became completely fed up with the elites of the time. He said, you're the people who have the money. You're the ones that can make these changes. And he said, and you're not doing any of it. All right, then I'm going to talk to the people that you use as the workers. And he started writing a series of letters called Flores Clavigera, which is a complicated title which we won't explain today, but you can catch me at lunch, where these letters are all addressed to the workers of England, and to try to get them to think about the predicament that they were in so that they would begin doing themselves things. He says in the first letter of Flores Clavigera, he says, I have listened to many ingenious persons who say we are better off now than we were before. I do not know how well off we were before, but I know positively that many deserving persons of my acquaintance have great difficulty in living under these improved conditions. Also that my desk is full of begging letters, eloquently written either by distressed or dishonest people, and that we cannot be called as a nation well off while so many of us are either living in honest or villainous beggary. For my part, I will put up with this state of things passively not an hour longer. I am not an unselfish person, nor an evangelical one, but henceforward, with any few or many who will help, I will do my poor best to abate this misery. When his father died in 1864, he inherited probably something on the order of $40 or $50 million in currency, current funds. By 1870, he had spent almost all of it for charities, for art, for educational systems, for ways to help people. He wasn't broke, but he was so depleted that he had to issue books again that he didn't want to issue anymore so that he'd have his own money to live. He decided, okay, I'm going to start my own organization. I'm going to call it the Guild of St. George, and he established it on Turner's birthday. And the Guild of St. George was essentially dedicated to slaying the dragon of modernity. And the Guild of St. George, he bought up land in London, he bought up land in the middle of England, which we'll probably hear about in a later talk, and he tried to make this into a place where people could go and live healthy lives and do good work and not be essentially consumed by this notion of a rage to be rich. This was his motto. He had learned, today is the day that you have. The other days you don't have. And through the 1870s and the 1880s, he kept doing these things. And this is a wonderful painting by his friend William Gershom Collingwood of him at his desk at Brentwood. You can see the mountains outside. And through the 80s, he continued to do these critiques of his society. Remember this, it was still going on. He has a wonderful essay called The Storm. It was a lecture first, which I'm going to share a passage with you in a second, called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. Remember the Turner painting of the tugboat belching smoke, taking the beautiful ship to its grave. And he became absolutely furious at this. He wouldn't stop, and they had less and less to do with him. So he says he was invited to London to do this lecture that he called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. And this, he said in it, it's one of his fantastic passages. Blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. If you ask me for any conceivable cause or meaning of these things, I can tell you none, according to your modern beliefs. But I can tell you what meaning they would have borne to the men of old time. Remember, for the last 20 years, England and all foreign nations, either tempting her or following her, have blasphemed the name of God deliberately and openly, and have done iniquity by proclamation, every man doing as much injustice to his brother as it is in his power to do. Of such states in moral gloom, every seer of old predicted the physical gloom, saying, the light shall be darkened in the heavens thereof, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. So I leave you to compare at leisure the physical results of your own choices and their consequences, and the undeniable fact that the empire of England, on which formerly the sun never set, has become one on which she never rises. He was still wonderfully adept with his writing. In 1888, he's now in failing health. He had a series of mental attacks, about which much could be said, but we don't have time. He made his last trip to the continent, and he went to the valley of the Chamonix, which I have mentioned before, which he loved so much. And he had a rock halfway up the mountain on the other side of the valley, facing Mont Blanc. He had a rock that he went to every time there. It was a great erratic. And he would go and he would sit there, and he had chosen it because it has the best view of the valley, which I'll show you in a moment. And then 25 years later, some people who admired Ruskin and loved how much he had loved their mountains and their place put a plaque there on the rock itself, which is still there to be seen. And that's the view. That is part of you can see why he might have gone up there. Usually when he would get there in the early years with his parents, he would just hop out of the carriage and run up the hill so he could have the view. It's the best in the valley. Yes. Chamonix and the French Alps here was the place where the angels of heaven dropped down to bless the cathedrals of the earth. Isn't that lovely? He wrote the last epilogue to Modern Painters. A new edition was coming out. So far from, remember, all of Modern Painters is about art. So far from art's being immoral, in the ultimate power of it, nothing but art is moral. Life without industry is sin, and industry without art, brutality. And this I say without reservation, that the knowledge of what is beautiful leads on, and is the first step to the knowledge of the things which are lovely and of good report. And that the laws, the life, and the joy of beauty in the material world of God are as eternal and sacred parts of his creation as in the world of spirits' virtue and in the world of angels' praise. On this same trip, not 5 weeks later, maybe 3 weeks later, he had a mental attack that was worse than many of the others. And he was taken home to Brentwood, where he lived the last decade of his life, virtually silent. He wrote one more chapter in his autobiography, and he died on January 8, 1900. And they made a wonderful monument to him in Coniston's churchyard in St. Andrew's churchyard. Here it is, a lovely Celtic cross. And all the panels of it, Collingwood designed this, and all the panels of it tell the story of his life. Here is St. George taking on the dragon. And here's one on the other side. John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, the young, wonderful, idealistic fellow that turned into this scathing critic of society. How important was Ruskin? James Smetham was an artist of the time, and he read Ruskin, and here's what he wrote to a friend. I quite envy you your first reading of Ruskin. Ruskin is a revelation of a new world. I do esteem him to be one of the noblest creatures that ever breathed God's vital air. I shan't soon forget the silent farms and solitary ways where I first drank in modern painters, the stones of Venice, and the 7 lamps of architecture. It only wants the remove of a century to show him in his colossal proportions. And here's Tolstoy. He wrote this while Ruskin was still alive. Ruskin is one of the most remarkable of men, not only of England in our time, but also of all countries in all times. He is one of those men who thinks with their hearts. And so he thinks and says what he himself has seen and felt, and what everyone will think and feel in the future. Gustav Borglum visited Brentwood in Ruskin's last years, did some sketches, and created this wonderful life sculpture of him, which is in the foyer right now, which I hope you will take some time to have a look at. It's Gabriel Meyer's recent find, and it's a wonderful sculpture of Ruskin. So honored, huh? This last line is very famous, and I just thought I must leave this with you at the end. Ruskin wrote at the end of Unto This Last this passage, and I think it is glorious. I thought it was glorious the first time I read it. I've now read it probably 100 times. It's still as glorious. There is no wealth but life. Life, including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. That country is the richest, which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. That man is richest, who, having perfected the function of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possessions, over the lives of others, from the last essay, which is in this collection. We are back in its 1864. We are in an audience, and Ruskin is lecturing. He has a new title for this lecture. It's called Of King's Treasuries. He's been asked to lecture because he's so famous. And he says at the very beginning, I'm going to tell you about the king's treasuries, but it's not what you think. The king's treasuries are the truths that are in the great books. All the great books of creation that have come out in the history of Western civilization that you should be reading. And the whole lecture is really about this. If you're interested in literature, you have to read this essay. It is just the most glorious thing about the importance of reading that has ever been penned, certainly that I know about, and how it will transform our lives. Ruskin said if you read the greats, he has in mind Plato, and he has in mind Homer, and he has in mind Francis Bacon, and he has in mind, of course, Shakespeare. If you read the greats of history, you will find they all say exactly the same thing. When you come finally to their deepest meaning, they all say there is no wealth but life. They all come to that conclusion. And of course, being Ruskin, he's looking out at the audience, and he has, throughout the lecture, been chiding them because they haven't been reading the great books. They've been out making money. And so he's saying to them, in effect, that all the problems you see around them, there's a wonderful section in the lecture where he lays this out, all the problems you see around you, the destruction of nature, the misery of the poor, the terrible condition of most human lives are all your fault because you haven't done the things that human beings are supposed to do for each other, which is to take care of one another, to make each other stronger and weller and healthier and happier. That's what we're here for. And you're not doing it. You're out making money. So it's a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Ruskin, James Smetham said, it will take us a century to understand his colossal proportions. Well, that century has passed. And now we're in the second one. And it's time for us to begin thinking very seriously about Mr. Ruskin again and bringing him back to the forefront and all the wonderful things that he said then that are still deeply relevant to this troubled age in which we live. Ruskin is a great chambered nautilus. There are so many rooms. And when you get into Ruskin, that is one of the great delights. This is what Smetham meant, at least to me. You go down into these rooms and you're just overwhelmed with how wonderful and important these things are. You can go into the art rooms. He will teach you about art. He will teach you about what is great art. He will teach you about what is inferior art. He will teach you about what it is about art that is absolutely essential in human life. Yeah? You can go into the architecture room, which is a sub-room attached to the art room, and learn about architecture and what makes the 7 lamps of architecture. The metaphor means these are the 7 things that if we do, turn a boring building into a great one. And you will learn about architecture in a way that you never have before. Yeah, you can go into these rooms. You can go in. Almost all of the modern painters' books are just laden with nature. And he will teach you about nature and why nature is so important and wonderful. And so, as I come to the end, which I probably should have been at 10 minutes ago, as I come to the end, I want to leave you with this thought, that as still the most important room for us to go in is the room where he critiques the society, because we are the same essentially now as we were then. Out for ourselves, thinking about how we can make our own lives more comfortable rather than taking on the care of all those around us. Ruskin brings us back to our best selves. He reminds us not only that God has lent us the earth for our life, but that it still is a great entail. Thank you.